Hello everyone, I hope you're all doing very well and that your Ramadan is going beautifully, whether you're fasting or not. Welcome to #What the Patriarchy, where we are planning the destruction of the patriarchy from its roots, especially in the context of religion and more specifically in the context of Islam, currently or mostly one book at a time. Okay. If you're new, I encourage you to listen to my introduction where I discuss what I'm doing, what my plans are with this vlog. Spoiler alert though, I want to uproot the patriarchy. And the way that I'm going to do that, as I've said before, is in two ways. The first is through reading books and discussing the books with you here that I have read that help explain how the patriarchy works, how it made its way into Islam, how it is so embedded in the religion now, if in all religions and all communities really, but so embedded in Islam that we sometimes can't tell the difference between Islam and patriarchy. And I promise you, when people say that's not Islam, that's culture, what they really mean is that's not Islam, that's patriarchy, but we're not calling patriarchy what it is. And sometimes it is so deeply embedded in Islam or in our understandings and practices of Islam that if something isn't patriarchal, is it even Islamic? And the second way we're going to uproot the patriarchy is by questioning and challenging existing and mainstream answers to very real, very valid questions about pretty much all things Islam and gender. And what I'll do is to offer alternative responses to those questions and not to claim that my answers are more correct than the patriarchal ones, although I do think they are. But to illustrate the bigger point of the role that patriarchy plays in shaping Islam for us, and also just to let you see what an answer might look like without an influence of patriarchy, or that is actually anti-patriarchal, because that is very, very much possible. Now, today's discussion is going to be on one of the most important books ever written in the course of human history. It's kind of an obvious choice for me as the first book that I want to talk about here, given that it's a classic now at this point on pretty much all things Islam and especially all things Islam and gender. This famed book is Qur'an and Woman, Rereading the Sacred Text from a Woman's Perspective by Dr. Amina Wadud. Okay. It was first published in 1992 and the second edition came out in 1997 with Oxford University. As you can see, it's it's brief, it's short, it's small. It's not intimidating in my opinion. It's not overwhelming, although the knowledge in it may be very overwhelming because it requires us to interrogate and challenge and rethink and also unlearn so much of what we already know and then relearn it. And not only is it a classic at this point, but the arguments that are made in here, the points that are made in here are so obvious at this point. They're very, very logical. It just makes perfect sense now. Although, of course, when she wrote this at the time in the 1990s, it did not make sense and she got a lot of backlash for it. We'll talk about that briefly later. And because the arguments in here are so important and so essential, and at this point now, currently very obvious, we're going to keep returning to it, keep coming back to it in pretty much most of the episodes here in this channel. Oh, and it also comes with a glossary of key Arabic terms that is always very helpful to have. Both editions also come with a preface, the second one partly explaining also how the book has been received so far, which is something that I'm always interested in. I want to know how people are reading and receiving, especially academic books on Islam and gender. It also raises this very important point about the utterly false dichotomy of the West versus Islamic, or the West versus Islam, as if the two are mutually exclusive, as though you can't be Islamic and Western at the same time. Basically what happens is that some Muslims are very, very fond of accusing especially non- and anti-patriarchal scholars and activists of being Western, which to them is apparently the total opposite of Islamic, which is incredibly out of touch with reality because, first of all, quit giving credit to the West for all things beautiful, all things egalitarian and justice and love and compassion and equality. The West did not invent the idea of justice, especially gender justice. And second, do you have no idea of what Western history, Western civilization have been like historically to marginalized people, including and especially women, but also people of different races? So the West, again, did not invent this idea of gender equality. But back to the book itself, its primary objective is to read the Quran in a way that is practical and meaningful to Muslim women today. And therefore providing a reading or interpretation of the Quran that is not polluted, not tainted with stereotypes about women or men. By stereotypes, we're talking about things like women are weak and therefore not fit for leadership, men are logical, women are irrational, men are the default breadwinners or should be the default breadwinners of the family. Men are therefore strong. Women should obey men. Women don't have as strong a sexual drive as men, and other lies that the patriarchy is built upon. And these biases and these stereotypes and such matter because we read them into the scripture, into texts, even if they are not explicitly or directly present. And then we also explain or justify those interpretations using or relying on our biases and assumptions. It's a very circular thing that ends up happening in a patriarchy. So for example, the patriarchy restricts women to their biology, but it doesn't restrict men to their biology. This is not a Quranic thing, but it can become a Quranic thing according to how we read the Quran. Oh, fun fact, by the way, and this isn't in the book. I want to address it anyway because it's related to this idea that women are emotional and men apparently are not. And to be emotional in the case of women is a bad thing. A bad thing as in it makes them illogical and therefore inferior to men, right? So have you ever noticed how the patriarchy accuses women of being so inherently jealous, right? And that jealousy is a bad thing? Yeah, well, male jealousy is a real and often very violent and threatening thing. But it's so validated in a patriarchy that literally laws are created to honor and protect and preserve male jealousy. I mean, really ask yourself why it is that women are told not to do X, Y, Z, because the answer probably has to do with, oh, because men are emotional in a bad way, and that these men will get jealous and angry, and so men are allowed in all patriarchies everywhere to control women exclusively to protect their jealousy. And if you want to make sense of this, don't bother because the patriarchy is founded entirely or almost entirely on male insecurities and male feelings and male emotions. And therefore, it is just absolutely illogical. It just doesn't make sense. Now, back to the book. The ultimate argument of the book is that one's perceptions of women influence their interpretations of the Quran. The person's intentions and biases and opinions and experiences are all reflected in their interpretations. And of course, men's experiences, or really the experiences of anyone who is reading the text, are not universal. They're very culturally or time or otherwise specific, and imposing them or reading them into the text only shows how limited our capacity is to understand and apply the text into our lives without the background that we come to it with. And of course, then there's the issue of translation, which I hadn't thought about until I read this book. You see, not all languages are gendered. Arabic is absolutely gendered. And so we face a lot of issues when we translate the Quran into non-gendered languages. Because to translate the Quran into non-gendered languages, then we have to make interpretive decisions like what a certain passage or a certain word means, what its purpose or intention might be, what the principle behind it might be, and so on, so that we can translate it into this new language, into this other language as correctly as possible, which becomes a problem because most Muslims do not speak or do not know Arabic, and even if they do, they don't necessarily know classical or Quranic Arabic, which is very different from contemporary or modern Arabic. So what happens is these Muslims, or pretty much all Muslims, then end up having to rely on translations of the Quran in a language that they understand, which means that they have to rely on interpretations of the Quran that are done by people who translated the Quran according to, again, their perceptions, their biases, their expectations, and so on. Academics love to say that nothing happens in a vacuum. And as tiring as it is to hear this, it's actually especially the case for scriptures and for religions. You see, interpretations of scriptures don't happen in a vacuum because they are products of the specific individual and collective contexts in which we read them and apply them and make meanings of them. And I think that's one way to sum up Wadud's argument in this book. Now, throughout Islamic history, nearly all interpretations of the Quran, and certainly all the mainstream ones that you and I probably know, are done by men, which means that women's experiences and values and vision, and also their biases, really, really important, are not reflected in our understanding of Islam. Which means that the interpretations of the Quran that we have today reflect only those of the men who interpreted them. While women's interpretations may not necessarily be more just or egalitarian or kind or compassionate than men's ones, what this does tell us is that there are profound gaps in our understanding, in our knowledge of Islam, and certainly of the Quran, as well as in our applications of the Quran, because it's missing the perspectives of an entire gender, an entire group of people based entirely on their gender. So to illustrate and prove her argument, that our interpretations of the Quran are shaped and affected by our contexts, our backgrounds, our experiences, who we are not, what we want and expect from the Quran, and so on. Wadud looks at several Quranic verses on the theme of gender, such as the creation story, marriage, female testimony, divorce, male authority, the hereafter, and whether our gender is at all relevant in the hereafter. And she also looks at the Quranic view on the women that it mentions, like Maryam and Bilqis and the wife of Fir'aun, Asiya. The Quran actually reveres these women greatly, and it treats them very well. And I don't know if you've ever read the passages on these women, especially with Musa and Bilqis in them, with the mother of Musa. So the mother of Musa is highly revered in the Quran, and the way that Allah comforts her as she's freaking out about having to give up her child, right? The way that the way that God comforts her in the Quran is really incredibly beautiful, and it's something that my students always point out when we're reading those passages in one of my classes. And then of course there's Bilqis, the queen of Sheba, who is very highly revered in the Quran as well, and her authority and leadership are very much admired in the Quran. I'm not going to talk about all of these topics. I'm just going to address a couple of them to highlight the argument that Wadud is making and how she supports it. A careful reading of these verses in the Quran shows very excellently how male perceptions and male biases against women make it into the application and the interpretation of the Quran. My personal favorite examples are the creation story and the conveniently, dramatically different meanings of the word nushuz in the Quran. I'll talk about the creation story in more detail, but for now, for the word nushuz, we see this term in Quranic verse 434, in verse number 34 of chapter 4, and also in the same chapter 4, verse number 124. So in 434, which is a very, very complicated, very difficult, and potentially very painful verse that I'm not going to talk about now, but we're going to have to at some point, so I will. But this is where our biases and gendered assumptions come into play yet again, because in 434, for women, in the context of what to do when women commit nushuz, the translations typically say something like, when a woman commits nushuz, she's being rebellious or disobedient to her husband, and so on. But for 124, for men, when men are committing nushuz, the verse is translated typically as something like the husband is being contemptuous, or he's not treating his wife right, or he abandons her, or he's being oppressive towards her. Which is interesting, of course, because 434, according to the traditional and mainstream interpretations of it, requires a husband to physically discipline his wife, which means to hit her, which means that you're mistreating her, which is called out in 124 supposedly. Do you see where I'm going with this? If not, don't worry, don't try to make sense of the patriarchy, because the patriarchy just never makes sense. Now, as for the creation story, even though we know now that the Quran never actually blames Eve for anything, not for committing the first sin, not for eating the fruit first and then giving it to Adam, or for seducing and deceiving Adam to eat it as well, literally the entire male tafsir tradition of the past, at least until the 20th century, blames Eve for everything. You see, the Quranic account of the creation is not detailed at all. It's scattered all over in different parts of the Quran, different passages and surahs of the Quran. And there's a lot of gaps that we haven't yet filled. It's just really difficult to fill them using only the Quran or even only Hadith. But the biblical account of the creation story is somewhat more detailed. And so these scholars of ours, these past scholars of ours, they relied almost entirely on the biblical tradition. And they decided and concluded that from the Bible, from the biblical tradition, that God created Adam first, and then from Adam, from his ribs, God created Eve, and so on, okay? And that God expelled both of them because Eve eats the fruit first, and that she seduces Adam to do it as well, and so on. This is objectively speaking from the Quranic perspective. This is not true, because the Quran never blames Eve for anything. It certainly never blames her exclusively. It blames either Shaitan alone, or Adam and Shaitan, or Adam and Eve. Okay, it doesn't blame Eve. Oh, side note, by the way, isn't it so convenient that our male scholars very easily turn to the Bible to support their patriarchy, and again, a very specific version of the story to support their patriarchy, but then turned around and hypocritically told us that we're not supposed to use non-Islamic sources to understand Islam. And of course, they used only the mainstream understandings, not the feminist ones, for example, because if we cared about the biblical tradition, then we would also, at least in contemporary times, rely on the feminist responses to those interpretations. But also, even the actual biblical version, the biblical account of the creation is really complicated, and there's two of them that are actually very different from each other. There's also a Lilith, for example, who's not named in the Bible, but she is in the biblical tradition, but Eve gets preference because, well, patriarchy. And then, of course, there's the fact that the Quran tells us that all humans came from one same nafs, which is a feminine word that means the soul, but all of our scholars decided that the nafs here was Adam because they had just decided and concluded that Adam was the first being created, and whether the nafs is the same thing as Adam or not is open to debate. It's not a done deal. Now, the reason why this is an excellent illustration of Wadud's point, this whole discussion on the creation story, is that it shows concretely how our past male scholars read into the Quran what was available to them, given their own cultural context, historical context, existing norms and knowledge that was available to them at the time, their assumptions and their attitudes towards women. They all read all of that into the Quran. One of my other personal favorite things to point out from Wadud's discussion in all of this, of how our biases affect how we read the Quran, is the translation and therefore the interpretation of the word zawj. When the Quran uses the word zawj, it seldom means wife. It nearly in all cases means either a gender neutral spouse or partner or mate, or it means your male spouse, male partner, right? So zawj literally is masculine form for the word partner. Yet the scholars imagined their own selves, themselves as men, as the audience of the Quran, so that when the Quran says something like you and your azwaj, these scholars decided that that meant you and your wives, when actually it means you and your spouses, you and your partners of any gender. The other thing that Wadud does is to look at the socio-historical context of the verses in question, the grammatical structure, and how these verses say what they say. And she also looks at other related verses of the same theme for a more complete, more holistic, or as complete as possible an interpretation of these verses. Now, we don't always know what the context or the correct context of any verse is. In my opinion, though, we don't ever know what the context of any Quranic verse is, because too many times the context is added on later on in the tradition, long after the interpretation of a particular verse has been established. So the context is added to support or corroborate the established understanding of that verse, which may be wrong. So what Wadud does then is to consider the intent or the principle of the text, its implications or its consequences, the impact of a given verse in a given context, what happens when we actually apply that interpretation that we agreed on. If the result is bad, or especially if it is violent, then can we claim that this was the intended meaning of the text? Then could this really be divine? She suggests, as have other scholars before and after her, that the principles of the Quran don't change, and the principles are often vague and general enough to be applied to many different contexts and times and generations, but our understandings of the principles can and do and probably should change. Now, this may be because the understandings of the Quran, the interpretations of the Quran, reflect the principles of the community that is interpreting it. And this kind of has to be the case because the Quran claims that it is applicable universally and eternally, which means that it's also flexible enough to be applied to many different contexts and times. An example of a principle and how its meaning can change with time and context is modesty. The Quran, like pretty much all other scriptures, encourages its readers and its believers and its followers to be modest, but it doesn't ever tell us how exactly to be modest. Fun fact, by the way, the headscarf, the idea that we have to wear a hijab meaning the headscarf, is not in the Quran. Okay, now I want to end soon, but I do want to also address and highlight some really important points from this book and from other works of Wadud's. So first, neither the Quran nor its interpretations are a done deal. Sure, we don't have any more revelations happening. The Quran isn't being revealed anymore. Any parts of the Quran aren't being revealed anymore. But what I mean is that as long as Muslims are reading the Quran for a better understanding, as a source of guidance, then the Quran remains negotiable. It remains open to interpretation. And there's no logical or just or good or fair reason why the interpretations of any one community or generation or gender or group of people should be the interpretation of the Quran. So here's the thing. Wadud has argued elsewhere, in my opinion rightly so, that conflating interpretations of the Quran with the Quran itself, which is God's direct words, as most Muslims see it, is a form of shirk. God's words are not the same as human interpretations of God's words. You may personally choose to follow a certain interpretation, and that's great, fine, but that doesn't mean that everyone else should as well, or that that's the only option available to us. The third point that I want to address here, and this is from the book, is that Wadud argues that while there are some differences between the genders, and keep in mind that this book is written in the 1990s when our knowledge of gender wasn't as advanced as it is today, and we're still learning more and more about gender, but those differences are not essential. These differences aren't essential enough to ascribe value to our gender, which is in strong contrast to what our historical male scholars claimed because they said and they imagined and absolutely lied that men are strong and intelligent and are preferred by God because they are strong and intelligent, and they're strong and intelligent because they're preferred by God. Do you see the circularity here? And hashtag shout out to my dudes Zamakhshari and Ghazali and literally every other one. Women, however, are weak physically and spiritually and intellectually because hashtag menstruation, you understand. And because they menstruate and because they are physically and intellectually and emotionally and spiritually weaker than men, God has no reason to prefer them. But Wadud argues that our gender is irrelevant to God. So, for example, the punishments and the rewards that we receive in heaven are not to do with our gender, they are to do with our actions, our piety, right? Taqwa. And neither do these distinctions, these very non-essential distinctions between the genders, explain why there should be any kind of a hierarchy between them, between the genders. Oh, and most importantly, the Quran doesn't gender our roles. There's no such thing as gender roles in the Quran. That is to say that the Quran doesn't indicate or dictate in any way that a woman's job is to stay at home and have babies and then raise those babies and also practically raise or babysit their husbands, while husbands work for pay outside of the home. This is not in the Quran, but Quranic verse 434 has been interpreted that way, which brings me to my next point, which is that Quranic verses can be categorized into descriptive and prescriptive, or general and specific. Descriptive verses are those that simply merely describe an existing reality rather than dictating how things should be, while prescriptive verses are those that tell us how things should be and what to do and what not to do. The descriptive verses may be time or culture specific, and the prescriptive ones may be more universally applicable. How this is to be determined is very complicated, and we don't really have a set of guidelines that we can all agree on, and I don't think we need to, although some scholars have tried, and in my opinion not successfully, to figure out how this distinction works. My personal opinion, however, is that this distinction should be made collectively by Muslim communities across the world, and the voices of those who are most negatively impacted or harmed by the applications of this decision should be prioritized. So, for example, if we decided that a certain verse is general and prescriptive and therefore should be applied one specific way, ends up having a harmful impact on any individual or group, then we must rethink our decision and change it accordingly. Another point is that the Quran should be read as a whole, as a complete text, not atomistically, not one verse by verse or word by word. So, for example, if you wanted to understand what the Quran has to say on marriage or on spousal relations, then looking only at 434 is probably a very, very, very bad idea, very terrible idea. Instead, we would need to look at 434 in relation to and in addition to all the other verses on marriage, such as Quranic verse 187 of Surah Al-Baqarah of the 2nd chapter, which tells us that spouses are garments for one another, or verse number 21 in chapter 30, which tells us that Allah has created mates for us so that we may live in tranquility with them, and that she has placed mercy and love in our hearts for each other. Right? Those are other verses that you should be looking at if you want to understand what the Quran has to say on marriage. Another point is that no interpretation of the Quran is objective, since, all the stuff that I just said, but I insist, if we believe that the Quran is a perfect book, and a lot of Muslims do believe that it's the most beautiful of all books, then we must keep working towards developing an interpretation of the Quran and application of the Quran that matches that claim, or at least tries to match that claim. We have to keep trying. And finally, patriarchy is shirk. Wadud has made this point in her other works. It's a part of what she calls the Tawhidic paradigm, which I think I might be addressing in a different episode, so I'm not going to get into now, but you can look it up. It's powerful and it is the truth. Now, if any of what I've said about this book and what it argues and what it shows sounds very simple or simplistic or obvious to you, I'm so glad that it's obvious to you, and that means that Islamic feminism is working. So you should probably hashtag thank a Muslim feminist near you. But you have to understand, these ideas may seem very obvious to us today, but that's because of her and other Muslim women, some of whom identify as feminists, who had to make a lot of sacrifices and also had to make a lot of these critical observations about the Quran and its tafsir, and pretty much change so much of what we believed about the Quran and about Islam previously. Okay, well, that's all for now. Thank you so much for watching and for listening. I'll be back soon, next week, inshallah, with the next topic, which will be either on the book Women and Gender in Islam by Layla Ahmed, or on menstruation and fasting and praying during menstruation, especially during Ramadan. Okay?